welcome. My name is Mike Rogan. I'm delighted to be chairing this session this afternoon. For those who haven't met me yet, I'm a member of the Neil Aggett Labor Studies Unit, or NALSU. As many of you know, NALSU is based here at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape and is engaged with policy, research, workers' education, and adopts a democratic, non-sectarian, non-aligned, and pluralist practice, and has active relations with a range of policy, advocacy, labor, and research organizations. As a unit, we're named after, or in honor of, Dr. Neil Hudson Aggett, a union organizer and medical doctor who died in 1882 in an apartheid jail after enduring an extended period of torture. We're here this afternoon, and we're very proud to co-host, along with the HSRC Press, to launch a new edited volume. The volume is entitled Labor Struggles in Southern Africa, 1919 to 1949, New Perspectives on the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union. The volume is co-edited by David Johnson, Noor Niftegoeden, and NALSU's very own Professor Lucien van der Walt. There are a range of contributors to this volume, and I'm very pleased to say that quite a few of them are participants today on Zoom, so we're delighted to have them and hope that they'll be able to participate in some of the question and discussion period as well. However, I would like to draw your attention to one contributor in particular. Professor Tom Lodge contributed to a chapter in this book on the relationship between the ICU and the South African Communist Party. Professor Lodge sadly passed away earlier just this week. We'd formally like to extend our condolences to the family and dedicate this launch here this afternoon to his memory. Professor Lodge wrote many classic works, including Black Politics in South Africa since 1945, All Here and Now, Black Politics in South Africa in the 1980s, together with Bill Nasson, and more recently, the groundbreaking work, Red Road to Freedom, A History of the South African Communist Party, 1921 to 2021. This is the first complete history of the party's 100 years. Could I ask if we could just have a moment of silence for Professor Lodge in honor of his passing? Thank you, comrades. Thank you, that was very moving. Before I introduce our speakers and the format, I'd like to say just a little bit about the collection itself, describe what the book is actually about. The collection provides fresh perspectives on the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa, also referred to as the ICU. Is by far the largest Black political organization in Southern Africa prior to the 1940s. The ICU was active in 6 countries and in global trade union networks and lasted into the 1950s. The chapters of the volume examine different aspects of the ICU's record, achievements, and failures in relation to the post-apartheid present. In its syndicalist one big union approach to workers' rights, emphasis on economic freedoms, internationalism, unmatched presence in rural areas and on farms, and its robust protection of women and migrant workers, the ICU overshadowed rivals such as the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, and the Southern Rhodesia Bantu Voters Association. It helped forge a popular counterpublic and promised freedom through a general strike. Not just an exercise in excavating struggle history, this volume demonstrates that the traditions and legacies of the ICU are of great relevance to contemporary Southern Africa. So we're delighted to have three speakers here this afternoon to discuss their contributions to the volume and the volume's overall significance. Two of the speakers are going to join us via Zoom online, and we'll have Professor van der Walt as one of the co-editors and chapter contributors address us in person. In terms of the formats, we're going to ask each of the speakers to discuss their contributions in the volume for about 15 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity to engage the presenters and contributors, bearing in mind that a number of contributors are joining us online as well. And I hope we'll have a good discussion after each of the speakers presents their contribution. So at this point, I'd like to invite the first speaker, Dr. Anusa Daimon from the University of Freiburg, who will look at the rise of the ICU in Zimbabwe, then Southern Rhodesia, in the late 1920s. Dr. Daimon's research looks at migration, transnational ethnic minorities, labor, and politics in Southern Africa. He is working on a monograph on Malawian migrant communities currently. So Dr. Daimon, if you're able to hear me, great, thank you very much. And would you like to share your screen?
Yes.
Or are you okay with just the camera?
To share something, I need to share screen.
Okay, great. And we can hear you perfectly? We're seeing your slides now, so you can begin anytime you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this launch of our book on the ICU. So I contributed a chapter to this volume, and my chapter was talking about the establishment of the ICU in Southern Rhodesia. And most importantly, I was looking at its early phases, its birth. Where the focus was on a particular period, which I regard as very, very critical for the establishment of the ICU in Southern Rhodesia. The first 5 months from February 1927 to June 1927. And in this case, I was trying to look at the birth of the ICU using a biographical narrative. So I was looking at a biography of a particular individual who was very, very important, in the formulation of the ICU in these early years. And that individual is a fellow known as Robert Sambo. Robert Sambo, of course, was a contemporary or a friend of Clement Kadali, the ICU founder, and he was sent, by Clement Kadali, with the mission to establish the ICU in Southern Rhodesia then. So in the process of writing the biography, the main challenge, which I highlight in the chapter there, was the issue of sources, which because Robert Sambo was not very well known, and because that period of 5 months is not well established in the Zimbabwean historiography, it points to the issue of sources, the problem with sources, particularly with regards to that early phase. And subsequently, of course, there's quite a lot about the ICU soon after, Robert Sambo, goes out of the scene. But of course, I managed to find a few sources. But what was more intriguing for me was that even in Clement Kadali's book, My Life in the ICU, Robert Sambo himself is mentioned not much. So I was, sort of, hunting for his sources in different places. But as I highlight in this slide, of course, I managed, to come up and find some critical sources that I thought from which, the biographical narrative was formulated. So what I was trying to portray in the chapter was basically how Robert Sambo and his colleagues, managed to irritate the Southern Rhodesian colonial government, in establishing the ICU. And there is quite a lot of history that I detail in the chapter, that by 1926, Clement Kadali himself was regarded as a prohibited immigrant in Southern Rhodesia. So the Southern Rhodesian government did not want to see him, in Southern Rhodesia. And so he had to devise ways of trying, to spread, his movement into, the shores across the Limpopo River. And he did this by sending, Robert Sambo, who was also a fellow Malawian immigrant in the territory. What I also highlight in these early chapters was, of course, the kind of impact, that in that short period of time, from February to June 1927, that, the ICU, Robert Sambo and the ICU made, particularly in Southern Rhodesia. I highlight that, it struck a new note of radicalism in that territory. And it represented, as Terence Ranger notes, it represented, a serious, radical political expansion and democratization, which was a big challenge to the Rhodesian colonial administrators. And what's more interesting there was that for the Rhodesian colonial authorities, they were also not, they did not really understand the kind of tolerance, that Clement Kadali, was being given, particularly in establishing the ICU and these activities, particularly in South Africa. They were sort of, amazed and surprised, by that tolerance that was happening. But for the Rhodesians, they did not tolerate, any radical African, activities, political activities in that territory. So I detail in the chapter that as soon as Robert Sambo, began to establish the ICU, starting from Bulawayo, going into Harare, he was, sort of a person of interest from the onset. So much that all his activities were monitored, by the colonial state. A lot of intelligence was generated upon him, police following his meetings and everything. But of course, in that short period of time, Robert Sambo, made a huge impact, managing to harness, to organize, a lot of grassroots political worker consciousness activity within the territories that he operated, particularly in Bulawayo, organizing urban workers, farm workers, and mine workers, to protest about the improvement of their working conditions and everything else. So I mentioned in the chapter that, the state, because it did not tolerate, that, it was so much, surprised, by the alarming success that Sambo had in that short period of time. Why? Because the Rhodesian state regarded, local African Rhodesians or Africans in the territory as passive, as happy, natives. So much that, the influence of the ICU, like what was happening elsewhere in the region, did not, go well with them. So by June 1927, just 5 months later, they decided to arrest Robert Sambo and then deported him from Southern Rhodesia on 24 June 1927. I detail in the chapter that, of course, the deportation of Robert Sambo from Southern Rhodesia raised a lot of dust, particularly for the colonial state. And it was also, exploited by Clement Kadali himself, because he used that, to put a much spotlight on the activities of the ICU in the region, as well as the intolerance, particularly of the Rhodesian colonial state. And by the time, during the time that Robert Sambo was deported, Clement Kadali, I recall, he was in the UK then. And, he had a lot of connections with the British Labour Party and all that stuff. And at one point, the issue of the deportation of Robert Sambo and another activist was discussed, in the British Parliament. And it's there in the book. But what is more interesting as well in my analysis of the narrative is that when he was deported, the assumption was that this guy would be deported back to Nyasaland or Malawi then. But of course, he did not go straight, to Malawi. He stayed in Mozambique. So when he stayed in Mozambique for about 2 months, he stayed in Beira from late June to August 1927. He was sort of reluctant to go back to Nyasaland because for him, I thought he felt maybe he had unfinished business. So he decided to go, found his way into South Africa, before going to Malawi. He found his way into South Africa, going through, Komati Port in Mpumalanga. And he managed to, to dupe the native constable who was at the port. He was manning the border post, and he was allowed, entrance into South Africa. And the native constable who allowed him to go, was berated, by the officials, for doing so. And in one of his letters, Sambo, explains the reason why he decided to go to South Africa and not go back to Nyasaland. He says, I had altered the course at Beira for South Africa, where I could have the freedom of protesting, against the Rhodesian government, much better. But of course, Robert Sambo's entrance into South Africa was illegal in all facets. And so he became a person of interest as well in South Africa. So he went to stay with a champion in Durban, and stayed there from September 1927 to March 1928, when eventually, the South African authorities apprehended him and eventually, deported him under the 1913 Prohibited Immigrants Act to Malawi. So from then on, he then went to Malawi. In the end of the chapter, I become a little bit intrigued as well by the kind of path that Robert Sambo eventually takes. When he goes to Nyasaland, Malawi, I think he becomes a disillusioned man to some extent, and instead of continuing with the ICU activity, with other colleagues within Nyasaland, he decides to join the African separatist or African independent church movement with other colleagues that he had left behind in Nyasaland. And so from 1928 until the 1940s, he became involved in the church. And I try to explain, because of the lack of sources, I try to explain in that section of the chapter that maybe him joining the African Independent Church movement had to do with his frustrations with lack of support from his associates within the ICU. And this can be explained particularly, when he decided to go to South Africa from Mozambique, when he was deported from Rhodesia. Instead of him going to stay with his boss, Clement Kadali, he decides to go and stay with Champion. So there are a number of things there that need to be unpacked, but because of sources, I was not able, to find a clear-cut reason, why he decided to join the church movement and not pursue, ICU labor consciousness movement, particularly from his end. So in the end, there are some conclusive reflections that I try to draw within the chapter, particularly, most importantly, to do with his legacy. Of course, he was a pioneer in establishing, ICU activity, bringing ICU activity within Rhodesia. And what's more important there is that, Robert Sambo operated in very, very risky, territory or treacherous waters. Why? Because the Rhodesian state, unlike other states within the region, did not tolerate, such activity at that point, which explains, the sort of, stillbirth, that the ICU experienced under him for the first 5 months. And then another important point is the kind of legacy, that Robert Sambo leaves, particularly with regards to, the kind of inspiration, that he had. So I argue there that he set the foundation, for the eventual, establishment of the ICU. And he gave it a more solid footing after his departure. Why? Because in the literature, from 1928, people like Dumbuchena, Masocha Ndlovu, take over and establish, more ICU activity in the organizations from 1928 onwards. So he sort of, laid the foundations, for these future ICU activists in Southern Rhodesia. And of course, I say in the conclusion as well as in the chapter that this part of ICU activity, particularly in Southern Rhodesia, is not that pronounced. Robert Sambo and his activity sort of, remain a sort of a footnote in Zimbabwean historiography. We know a lot about, other subsequent ICU activities after Robert Sambo leaves, after 1928, Benjamin Burombo, Masocha Ndlovu, and all these other guys. We know quite a lot. There's a lot that has been written about these guys, but very, very little, about the concerns that I highlight in this chapter. And then I finish off by saying that unlike, Clement Kadali, who's well known, was famous, and until, the publication of this chapter in the volume that we are discussing today, very little was known about him. And there's still, of course, a lot that needs to be unpacked about him if more sources are found, particularly what happens when he gets to Malawi and joins the African Independent Church. The trail, sort of dies there because the sources are not that pronounced. So I believe that the chapter is very, very critical in that respect. That it gives us, some, early background history, about ICU activity. The 5 months, that were very, very critical, in the birth as well as, emergence or development of the ICU in Rhodesia or present day Zimbabwe. So I thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview of your contribution. The next speaker is Professor Lucien van der Walt, who will be speaking on the ICU in Namibian mining towns. Prof. van der Walt is currently the director of the Neil Aggett Labor Studies Unit, as well as a professor in the Department of Sociology and Industrial Sociology here at Rhodes University. Sorry, I lost my place there. He's published widely, including the volume Anarchism and Syndicalism in the Colonial and Post-Colonial World, 1880 to 1940, published in 2010 with Stephen Hirsch, and more recently, Politics at a Distance from the State, Radical and African Perspectives in 2018, along with Professor Kirk Helliger, also here from the Department of Sociology at Rhodes. So, Prof, thank you. Click your button.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'd also like to welcome other contributors. I can't see the full list in front of me, but earlier I saw Peter Lim. I saw Chitja, Twala, who's going to speak a bit later, Elizabeth van Heineken, Seppo Malloy, Nicole Ulrich, and we'd like to welcome all of you and all of those who've joined online. A project like this is not possible with just a few people, and we worked on this book since 2019. 2019 was the 100-year anniversary of the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa, or the ICU. We worked closely with the History Workshop at WITS. We workshopped the issues, and we were very pleased to bring together such a great team. So I don't think our co-editor Nur Niptakurin is here, but David Johnson's here, but this is a collective project, and I want to stress that. I looked at the ICU in Southwest Africa, now Namibia, and comrades will see in the back, there's a display of posters, photos around the strikes that took place in Southwest Africa in 1971, 1972. And very often people tend to think that the history of the workers' movement and of strike action in Namibia dates to the 1970s. And very often people tend to think that the history of the union movement in Namibia is simply the story of the unions that were linked to the Southwest African People's Organization, a nationalist movement which was allied to the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. But when we look back, we actually find the first trade union in Southwest Africa was the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union. Now, a bit about the ICU to link it up, and you'll see where Anusa's discussion, mine, and Chitja's put together. The ICU was a mass movement. It started in Cape Town in 1919. In 1920, it merged at Bloemfontein, Mangaung, with a number of other unions, and became a larger union. It brought together on a large scale, for the first time ever, Black and colored workers. In the mid-1920s, from around 1925, the ICU explodes across South Africa. But unusually and very differently to later trade unions, its growth is primarily in the countryside. It's on farms, it's in traditional areas, and it's in small towns and dorpies. And some of this will be picked up by Prof. Chitja Twala. So it's actually quite different. The ICU was active, for example, in Butterworth, in King Williamstown and Port Alfred, and it was actually bigger in King Williamstown than in East London. So it's quite different in some ways. A second thing about the ICU is that it was, as Prof. Rogan said at the beginning, the biggest protest movement of the time. Now, yes, of course, no one can deny the historic importance of the South African Communist Party or of the African National Congress. But before the 1940s, the African National Congress was never over 4,500 members. Peter Lim, who's online here, has written some wonderful stuff around the early history of the ANC, and I'm sure he can talk more about it. The ICU was 200,000. The Communist Party of South Africa, founded in 1921, in the late 1920s, was increasingly influential, had several thousand members, trade unions, but it was still under 3,000. The ICU was 200,000. And beyond that, the ICU was transnational, and this is something that makes it very different. The ICU was active in South Africa, but in 1920, it became active in Southwest Africa, in Namibia. In 1927, as Anusa has indicated, it spread into southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, as well as into Eswatini, or Swaziland. In 1928, it established branches in Lesotho, which was then Basutoland. And 1931, it became active in northern Rhodesia or Zambia. So this is very unusual. And the ICU, the way it thought of itself, you don't see the word South Africa in its name or Zimbabwe in its name. And it tried to see itself, and it aimed at being one big union or one great union south of the Zambezi. In fact, it went north of the Zambezi and getting into Zambia. So it was a very important path-breaking movement. It was the first major protest movement in Zimbabwe, but the same, it was the first trade union movement in Southwest Africa. And we often miss this because when we think about the history of unions, we think in national terms. There is the story of the South African struggle, of the Zimbabwean struggle, the Namibian struggle. And then the ICU becomes a chapter, and then there's Kanetu, Saktu, Fosatu, Kosatu, and so on. But actually, the ICU doesn't fit into that. There's a story of the ICU that you can only understand by looking at 6 countries. The ICU was still active in East London in 1949. There's actually a Kadali Hall, very neglected building. And it was the biggest black protest movement in Harare in Zimbabwe in the 1950s. Okay. So what about its role in Southwest Africa? Look, the first thing to understand is Southwest Africa, now Namibia, was a colony of South Africa. Yes, South Africa was a British colony, but South Africa had its own colony, Southwest Africa, and it ruled it as a colony. So we spoke earlier in this week about how South Africa industrialized itself. This was never done in Southwest Africa. It was basically then and is now an economy based on raw materials, which historically are sold to South Africa. Diamonds, copper, fish, crayfish, and wool and meat. Okay. Now, it was extremely repressive labor regime, a very large country with a very small population. So when we look at the story of the ICU, it follows this pattern. It first emerges in Luderitz or Luderitz-Bucht, which was a port in southern Namibia. Now, Luderitz-Bucht is a small town, and it's actually in the middle of the desert. It's a harbor, and all around it's a desert. But in that desert are diamonds. And all the way from Luderitz-Bucht, all the way down south and north, were little diamond mining towns. So the ICU emerged in this port, which was the main connection in the south, into all these diamonds. It brought in food supplies into their water, exported diamonds, and then across there was a railway. It took us to a town called Keetmanshoop, which began as a mission station. It was a little farming town in the middle of this huge area of white-owned farms. The whole of southern Namibia followed the South African and Rhodesian pattern of large white commercial farms. So it emerged there. Then it's shifted and it starts to appear in more ports. Around 1926, it appears in Walvis Bay, which is a South African-owned port in Namibia, in a hostel, a workers' hostel with migrant workers. And then a bit later in Elizabeth Bay or Elizabeth Bucht, which is a mining town. Okay, again in a hostel. Now, what do we know about this union? As Anusa's pointed out, when we look at the past, the days are gone when we can interview the veterans of these movements 100 years ago. We have to look at the fragments of the past, documents from the government, which often, it's got a long history of spying on popular organizations, newspaper reports, leaflets, articles in the ICU's own newspaper, and so on. We find that the ICU there, one of its really interesting features is it united a very divided working class. In a place like Luderitz, the working class was made up of South Africans, black and colored South Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, by which we mean people really from the Caribbean, Jamaica and so on, many of whom were there because they worked on ships. The so-called crew, which are people from West Africa, also worked a lot on ships. And then local people, Ovambo, Nama, and other Khoisan and colored groups. And it actually managed to bring them together. It was based, though, not in the workplace. So when we think of a union now, we think of shop steward structures, we think of the workplace. But these workplaces were very small. It was very, very hard to organize. So they would organize the township. That's where they would be based. So it was sort of like a mix between a civic and a union. And many of the issues it raised were around that. Medical care for black people, pass laws, discrimination. Now, the other place it organized were the hostels where mine workers lived in these big compounds, which were closed compounds. Now, a closed compound makes it hard for workers to organize, but it actually also makes it easy for them to organize because all the guys stay together at night. All your workmates are with you in this place, eating the same food, facing the same compound manager, facing the same employer. Another interesting and important point, and I want to pick up with Anusa here, is the role of immigrants. Clemens Gadali, who's often seen as the founder of the ICU in South Africa, was from Malawi. He was what used to be called a Nyasa. Robert Sambo in southern Rhodesia was a fellow countryman of this. But in Southwest Africa, the immigrants who brought the ICU were South Africans. It was South Africans like Jimmy Laguma, who was an early member of the Communist Party from Cape Town. This is before he joined the Communist Party. In Walvis Bay, the records show a man called Timothy, only labeled Timothy, and Naftali were agitating for the ICU. In Elizabeth Bay, Ghana Chabalala, Kekopile, Mukhrosi, and Stand Right Mackenzie. So these were people here, and very often actually from the Eastern Cape. That's an interesting thing there. Now, because of how it was organized as a community-based group and the issues it took up, its politics were often similar to community groups, which is the politics of the meeting, then the protest march, then the petition. They didn't really have leverage because if a community protests, it doesn't really have structural power. You know, it's a policing problem. If there's a big unrest in Guinea or whatever, it doesn't really affect the mayor's income. It doesn't really, it's a political problem, but it's not the same as a strike at Volkswagen, which can cost billions a day. Now, this brings us to some of the problems that the union faced. Look, the first thing is because it didn't organize in workplaces, and it couldn't really, it was very, very hard for them to win anything. So people got tired of the union. It provided a place where you could vent your grievances, formulate programs, make demands, but it couldn't win anything very easily. It didn't have much leverage. Secondly, it was in these very small working classes. Namibia is huge, okay? It's a huge country. It's the biggest France, but the population is much smaller than South Africa. Even if you go to Windhoek, I mean, Windhoek's population, I don't know, it's... The total population of the country is about 2.5 million of Namibia. And a big town there is 40,000 people. So you have these very small working classes. Now, it's easy to organize. There's 2 or 3 townships. But it also means that it's easy for the government to monitor and control. So the government spent a lot of time watching people, blocking. Clemens Gadali tried to go to Namibia a few times. He was banned from the country. Other people agitated. They were deported. Timothy and Naftali, they were thrown out the country. So these small workplaces, small working classes, small residential concentrations helped them organize, but made them weak. Now, it's different if you're in a huge factory, but if you're dealing in hundreds of people in a small town, in the only location in the township, it's a different story. It also allowed people to be harassed. For example, one of the leaders of the ICU in Luderitz was John de Clou, who was actually from the Caribbean, and he got harassed. Once the government found out he was involved in the ICU, he ran a small business, restaurant, then they would stop giving him permits to run this. Okay. And it's the same. A lot of these guys were dealing with, they were organizing in rural areas. And as you know, it's incredibly hard to organize in rural areas. You're talking about huge farms, small workforces, very much in direct relation with the farm owner, quite a paternalistic, authoritarian labor relation. It's very hard for people to organize. You get targeted very easily. And I mean, this was very much like the South African situation. But the thing in South Africa is something happened to trigger organizing in the countryside in the 20s, and same in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia in the 30s. In both South Africa and Zimbabwe, the 20s and 30s saw massive changes in the countryside. Millions of people were uprooted off the land. People who were renting land were forced into wage labor or evicted. And this created heat that the ICU's materials could catch a light in. But nothing really happened in Namibia until the 1950s. Very stagnant economy, old relations, no real modernization, no real change. So the thing that could offset the problem of organizing on a farm, of the problems of isolation, paternalism, and quite a racist, repressive labor regime, the shock didn't come in. Now, I just need 2 minutes to wrap up. Look, the other thing is that the ICU's politics need some discussion. Now, I know we can debate in unions today what is the appropriate line, but generally speaking, South African unions today develop a particular program, which is then adopted at a Congress, which is then carried out. And it's quite strict, and you need to stick to it. The ICU was a very loose organization. So even its ideas would shift. So what if you were an ICU leader, the message you would give may be different to what you would give. And there were tensions in ICU politics that weren't really resolved. So sometimes the ICU sounded like Garveyite, a sort of early Pan-Africanism. Sometimes it appealed to a radical Christianity, you know, saying Jesus was a worker, was crucified, it should be on earth as it is in heaven, and so on. Other times the ICU would engage in petitions, and other times the ICU would call for a massive revolution in which workers would seize the farms and the factories and have a great liberation day. So these tensions between a sort of race-based and class-based organizing, between a socialist program and a nationalist program, between a radical program and a reformist program, went through the ICU. So it could be all things to all people, but sometimes when you're all things to all people, you're nothing to anyone. You know, a jack of all trades is sometimes a master of no trade. So it was incredibly important in mobilizing people, the rally, and I say a counter-public of getting people a place to speak and to galvanize and identify their problems. But it struggled to translate that into a program of power. So in closing here, the ICU's tensions between a sort of politics of Marcus Garvey, a politics of Karl Marx, a politics of anarcho-syndicalism like Mikhail Bakunin, a politics of radical Christianity, were unresolved. What often held the movement together was hope and the rally and the protest. But when you don't win anything, people get tired. And it starts to disintegrate and have infighting in that. And I'd say we can learn many things about the ICU. It's bravery in organizing in very difficult conditions. It's fight for equality. It's linking the community and the workplace. And its ability to inspire people in very harsh conditions, much harsher than we have, I would say, even under neoliberalism. But it didn't really have a consistent program of building power, building strong organizations, democratic accountability, deep levels of education. And this felt fire, as it was called by many of the organizers, like many felt fires, burnt out. And the ICU started to disintegrate in many places in the 1930s. And in its last years in South Africa, is about 2,000 people in East London. And after the leader, Clemens Gadali, gets ill and dies, the union fizzles away. But I think we can still remember it, and I think we can still respect that. And with that, I'm going to end my bit, and this will allow the next speaker to come on. So thank you for indulging me with that and allowing me to link the papers a bit.
Thanks, Lucien. And now our third speaker is Professor Chitja Twala from the University of Limpopo, and he'll be speaking on the ICU in small-town South Africa. Professor Twala works on liberation history and Bantustan history. He's been awarded fellowships at Harvard University in the US, the University of Ghana, and the University of California, also in the US. Prof, we can see you clearly. Do you need to share your screen, or will you just be speaking?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity and for the invitation. I am from an old school of thought, whereby I don't believe in PowerPoint, because I've seen so many people presenting in PowerPoint, but the points that they are making are not that powerful. Therefore, I'll desist from using a PowerPoint and just be a normal speaker. And thanks for the invitation, and also to be one of the contributors to this book, which we started in 2019 after the conference at Rhodes University. And also I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my co-author, Professor Peter Limpo is also here, and for also coming forth with the ideas as well as the archival material for this particular paper. We zoomed on the Free State, the then Orange Free State, in terms of localizing the ICU in small towns, because we are aware that some of the literature mostly would highlight the role of the ICU in bigger towns. And then there is that neglect, historical neglect in historiography also, in terms of what was transpiring in the smaller towns. It is also important to note that the Free State played a huge role in the labor struggles amidst the whole question of not having a lot of documents or literature in that regard. I've unpacked that in one of my publications, that you'll find that you've got Sosolberg, you've got Parys at the northern part of the Free State. In most cases, politically, they are highlighted as the places where the struggle was fought, and forgetting about the middle part of the Free State and the southern part of the Free State, which links to the Eastern Cape and links to Lesotho. But because of the press and the journalists will be interested in the northern part because of its proximity to the then Transvaal, Vanderbilt and all other areas, then the northern part will get some recognition than the inner part of the Free State. And we are acknowledging here the role played by the ICU as a mass movement in these small towns. And then we are targeting 2 decades, the 1920s and the 1930s. And with this chapter, we are trying by all means to highlight and then to put forth the voices of the voiceless, those people who played a part in the mobilization of the ICU in the small towns, and then whose names are not featuring anywhere in the historiography of the labor struggles and the ICU. And that is why we have decided to go the less traveled route, that of looking on the small towns and rather than looking at the bigger towns. And then the very same idea can be taken to other provinces, although we managed to look at the Free State only. In our chapter, we reveal the complex maneuvering of the local leaders in an uncharted kind of an environment, which was violent to all those who were trying to mobilize the workers into the labor struggles. Therefore, when you read this chapter, you need to read it within the context of what was happening then in the 1920s vis-a-vis what is happening today. And the whole question of mobilization was totally different in the 1920s as mobilization that we know of today. Therefore, the chapter assesses the political, industrial, intellectual history of the ICU. It also highlights the tensions between the national structures of the ICU with those of local sphere or the local branches. During that period, we noted that there were challenges. It was not easy for whoever to come and mobilize in these small places, in these rural utopias, or in the farms for that matter. One of the biggest challenges that we are noting in the chapter, it is the whole question of lack of mobilization resources. That in order to move from one town to another, it took much more time, as well as in order to have people who are on the ground mobilizing the masses on the farms, it was not an easy task. Because one, there were also challenges in terms of the hostility between the farmers, government, and the employers themselves. Therefore, people wouldn't want to be seen to be associated with something that will put their lives in danger, or whereby they will be incarcerated. Therefore, when we look at this chapter, we are looking at how these leaders managed to infiltrate these farms and mobilize the people in these small towns. And then secondly, mobilization was also grounded on issues that the workers were experiencing, like low wages on the farms, like the ill treatment by the farm workers. And that became a mobilization tool by the leaders at the local branches who mobilized these people. But it was also important to note that there was more of an indirect relations or contact with these people. We are mentioning in the chapter that the contact with these farm workers or with rural people in rural times used to take place in the townships rather than on the farms, although there are some pockets whereby the farms were used to mobilize people and meetings held in those farms. But in most cases, these people would travel to the townships in order to have such meetings. And that in its own was problematic because mobilization couldn't be boosted as the leaders would want it to be. But we acknowledge in this chapter and commend these leaders who managed to mobilize people despite all these challenges in the OFS small towns. In 1925, for an example, there was only one branch of the ICU, which was in Bloemfontein. But by 1926, there were 22 branches around the Free State of the ICU. And that shows that there was a growth in terms of opening up and establishing branches around the Free State. In 1928, there were 38 branches, and that also shows the growth despite all these challenges. But we also, in the chapter, highlight the role played by some important leaders and activists who mobilized people under the ICU. And then we are saying, in moving forward, that these leaders should be acknowledged and then should be commemorated in terms of what they did and then the role they played in the liberation and in the labor struggles. We note people like Kebo Mote, who used to have some meetings in a small town of Lentley in the Free State. Doyle Mudiakhuta, who was also a member of the ANC, but who also participated in the activities of the ICU around Tabanchu. John Musina in the place called Frankfurt, Jameson Molete mobilizing on the farms in Winbeck, which is about 100 kilometers from Bloemfontein. Labane Marabayele, who also mobilized in Marquardt, and Reverend Lauta also mobilized in the eastern part of the Free State in Harrismith and the surrounding areas. And then these leaders, together with more other leaders, played this significant role in highlighting the plight of the workers in rural areas. But little is written and documented about these leaders. And perhaps this platform will also assist in terms of highlighting such leaders and profiling them as the people who contributed to the bigger liberation struggle from the workers' point of view. By 1927, over 2/3 of delegates at the conference, which was held in Bloemfontein, were members of the ANC. But that in its own also became a problem because there was that friction and tension between the ANC and the ICU. And to an extent that one of the leaders of the ANC, Thomas Mtobi Mapigela, who was the Speaker of the ANC for 27 years since its establishment, noted that the ANC should move away and stay away from the activities of the ICU because this ICU is referred to by Mtobi Mapigela as a pseudo-political body, which was trying by all means to contest the political space with the ANC at the time. Therefore, we are saying with this chapter that a lot needs to be said about what was happening in the small towns and the rural topis, and at the same time, a lot needs to be said about the very same line of argument when we are portraying it countrywide and taking it to other provinces. And then we are also making a footnote remark and saying these leaders who are unknown and whose voices are shattered needs to be loud enough in order for us to know more about them. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. And can we have one final round of applause for all three speakers, please? We've got a few copies of the book here, and we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But for now, I think it would be useful to take a round of questions, comments for the speakers. If you could perhaps indicate if your question or comment is directed to one of the contributors in particular, I think that would be helpful. I'll come around with a microphone. And then I'll also have some help keeping track if there are any questions or interventions from those who are joining online as well. I think there's quite a bit of discussion in the chats already, but it would be useful, I think, if you could raise your hand in Zoom. That would be easiest for us to identify that you have a question. So I'm going to come around. I've got one hand so far. 2 hands and 3 hands. So I'm going to go in that order, and then we'll come back this way as well. Great. Thank you. And if you could please introduce yourself so that people online can see who you are as well.
My name is Nazan Üstündağ, and I am from the Kurdish Freedom Movement, also used to be a professor at the university. I have I love this. This is great. Thank you so much. I think we learned so much from looking at the history of social movements, especially 1920s. In the geography that I live in, there was a one based on the whole Balkans, and that mobilized actually Armenians and Balkan people and Turks together. I think what happened in the beginning of 1900s. And the transnational character of these unions is extremely important, and we have so much to learn from it. One question that I want to ask is, I think you are two questions I have. One is, you are pointing to an extremely important thing that we are facing all over the world. That is, when we want to organize something different, then we face the violence of the state. So, without taking this into account, that the state is a monopolizer of violence, and how are we going to defend ourselves against the monopolizing forces of violence is a lesson, I think, is a question that we have inherited, and that really needs to be addressed still. That's one lesson I learned from it. And the second thing is what you said about the unity and diversity thing. I'm very much impressed actually by the diversity of the movement, because I think diversity mobilizes. Having a lot of different leaders who speak different kinds of, who utilize different kinds of vocabulary for a social movement. So I think this is really important. So I am wondering what, is it your interpretation that they also needed unity, or is there evidence, what kind of evidence you have, and what kind of unity would you imagine, at what level? I think because having all the local leaders speak in the same language, in the same vocabulary, in the same through the same kind of program doesn't really help. It excludes so many people. So I think diversity is really important in a movement, and we have to address at what level we really need unity. Yeah, those are the things. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're going to take a couple at a time. So I'm going to head back here. Please introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Tulani from Ikora and Sabalaza Pathways Movement. So my question is that based on the environment which we find ourselves in, looking at the background of the ICU, that it was mobilized for by people who were coming from other countries, but were able to come and mobilize here to formulate workers' union. So what was or what is different from now and then? Because I'm imagining a situation now in South Africa where someone from other countries would come and mobilize a union. The response wouldn't be the same. I'm looking at this animosity towards each other in terms of tagging each other, foreigners and stuff. So what was different then and now? And secondly, I'm looking at the massiveness of this union, ICU, and the state which we are in now in terms of big unions. You see a number of unions going down, even the unions that are historically known to be a massive mobilizers have gone down in terms of numbers, in terms of challenging the status quo. So what is the difference then and now? Thank you.
Great. So we're going to go here, and then we're going to go in the middle there, and then we'll deal with those questions, I think. No, they need to.
Oh, okay. Mashubandile Kusane from Unemployed People's Movement and Makana Citizen Front. I'm going to be all over, but I'll try to make sense. I think the effect of the ICU speaks to what UPM believes in, because localizing the struggle, because we localizing the struggle and also testing things that were never done before without fear. For example, now if I can go back to issue of unions, I think maybe if you can use the term localizing in unions and shop stewarding. If you take a look at the formation of AMCU before it became Matunjo, it was an idea of shop steward being frustrated of the fact that the national leaders were not talking the same language that was being spoken by the shop steward. Hence the AMCU exploded, and this is my opinion. Till today, the only struggle that was won by a union in the new dispensation was the one that was advocated by AMCU when it was led by shop steward, which led to the bloodbath in the Northwest. So I think if I can try to make sense of what I believe, if the today's union struggles, if we can go back to sort of speak to the shop steward on the floor, to sort of make those who are national to understand exactly what is being said on the floor, because I believe the deteriorating rate of union membership today is given back to the fact that most shop stewards were frustrated with the fact that the leaders were speaking the language that they were not that they were transforming to them, but it becomes something else when it's there at the national level, and then it gets to the despondent of the workers on the ground. So I think the localizing the struggle of the community and also shop stewarding the struggle of the workers, it might work, given the example of the formation of AMCU, where everything that is being said at national level makes sense to even to that employee, to that worker who's on the floor of the firm, so as to have that kind of shop stewarding where the national leadership maybe should only their task should be maybe to check the understanding of or the suggestions or the struggle that the shop stewards are bringing forward to check if they are in relation with the legislature or the labor law, so that the talk between the so-called national leadership and the exec worker on the ground remains the same language. So because I think that's where the message was lost. When the shop stewards started talking something different from what the national leadership was bringing down.
Great, thanks. And then we'll just take one more before we turn back to the speakers.
Thank you, Prof. I'm covered by the two last speakers, but I think it is very important that we welcome and appreciate the presentations done here, because they're an eye-opener in the first place, and also, like personally, I knew a little about ICU, and today I'm confident to say I've got some knowledge of what the ICU is and what is the status of the ICU in South Africa, and also, yeah, I think let me stop there.
Thank you. We have two hands online. Should we ask the contributors to, and also a question as well in the comment box, but should we turn it over to Prof. Twala? Dr. Daimon, would you like to respond in any way to those comments and questions?
Thank you very much, Chair. I think we've got more comments than questions. But in terms of Thulani's comment or question, I indicated when I started that when we read the ICU's history, we should do that using our 1920s and 1930s spectacles, because that will help us to understand the political dynamics and the political climate of the time. And if we understand that, then that will also help us to understand what is happening today. That people would come from outside and come and mobilize in South Africa. And that shows that people were sharing the very same sentiments in terms of labor struggles, whether in Malawi or in Rhodesia or in South Africa. And then the ground was fertile for such people to can come and do the same. But as to whether can that be done today in our current dispensation, it is $1 million question, because the climate is totally different, and also the mobilization ways in terms of labor struggles are also different. Perhaps we need to come up and say, what is that we can learn from the ICU in order to take as a take-home point for the unions today? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Dr. Daimon, would you like to say anything, or are you covered for now?
Covered for now.
Okay, great. Thanks for staying with us, though. Prof. van der Walt, do you want to say a few things, or should we take a few more questions and comments?
Yeah, look, just quickly, but we need to get also some of the stuff online there. There's a couple of comments and questions, especially from Peter Lim. So I think after this, Peter Lim has been the co-author with Chitja. I think we just need to bring in that in a bit. Yeah, look, there's not easy answers here. With Nazan's point, how to organize differently, I think the ICU faced that problem because it was also heavily repressed. And that could mean administrative measures, for example, AWG Champion, who was the big ICU leader in Natal, now KwaZulu-Natal, was banned from the province. Kadali couldn't move into visit Namibia. People were expelled. But I do think it's important that we have a balance between debate and participation and difference. I agree with you. And unity. Where do we strike that balance? And I think with the ICU, the question wasn't really posed because the ICU, a lot of its politics was around the rally and the protest, but there wasn't really a sort of a clear long-term plan. The late Phil Bonner, who contributed a chapter to the book, said that between the ICU's vision, which it often expressed, of a revolutionary general strike in which the workers would take over the farms and factories, and its day-to-day practice of petitions, protests, and angry speeches, there was a huge gulf. So I think for me, it's not a question that the movement must be monolithic, but you have to develop a certain degree of agreement and coherence and manage difference, because the ICU was also not very good at managing difference. There were splits. Comrade Alfred Mafaleka, who's mentioned in the comments, the Communist Party was expelled at one stage, and not for really principled reasons, actually. Then the big leaders at ICU split, and so on and so forth. So it's an important question. There's the last thing about the immigration. Goes to your point, Nazan, goes to the question that was also raised by Tulani. Look, it's a difficult thing. It wasn't like there was no anti-immigrant sentiment in those days. In fact, there were Henry D., who contributed to the book. There were actually massive riots against Nyasas or Malawians in the late 1920s. And there were voices within the African National Congress and even in part of the ICU saying, deport them. So there was that. So there was a tension. And sometimes people would say, like some of the KwaZulu ICU leaders would say, I'm not going to be lectured by a Nyasa boy. I'm a Zulu man. So I think that makes it more remarkable that they're organized across borders, colored and black African, Malawian and Rhodesian and South African and that. And even, I think it's incredible, really. And maybe we should learn how they did that and not think it was just an easy job.
Great, thanks. So we're over time already, but here's what I think we should do. I'm going to ask Lucien just to say a few things now about the books we have here, what needs to happen with those, and then we're going to read some of the comments from the chat. And I can see we have two hands. We're going to call on two people to ask a question or raise comments online, and then we'll wrap up. So Lucien, just quickly about the books.
So for members of the public, for members of the public who are attending, we have a number of books on sale at quite a steep discount, but we don't have a card machine. So either you could, if you wish to purchase one, a member of the public, not members who are attending the Vuyisile Mini Workers School, you could hopefully buy one from us now. If not, you could contact me or Valence, and we will have stock on campus at Aggett House, at Neo Aggett House on campus. Beyond that, I don't think there's much more I'd say.
Except that this does strike me as an opportunity to get an autographed copy of the book. Let's not underestimate that value. Yeah, great. So to some questions online. We've got Prof. Hislop, sorry about that. Please unmute yourself, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'd really like to congratulate the editors and authors on producing this really exciting book on a fabulously interesting and really important topic. I've got three very quick questions, which is really about what the book brings that's new to our understanding. Lucien's made a huge contribution, I think, among many other things, in situating the ICU in worldwide syndicalism and that kind of labor movement of that particular time. There's also an issue, I think, which he and many other people have touched on, about the influence of Garveyism. And I'm just wondering what you think the book brings to our understanding of those kinds of ideological influences and maybe others which are important in the ICU? The second thing I wanted to ask is about the kind of chronology of the ICU. There are two things which I think are interesting here. The one is it starts in 1919, but the real takeoff seems to be around 1925 to the late 20s. And I wondered what accounts for that kind of chronology. Was there something in the mid-1920s that particularly boosted it up? And the third question is about a really interesting thing, which is that around 1935-36, there's this wave of dockers strikes around Southern Africa, including in Namibia, in protest against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And that seems to have something of an ICU flavor, something of a Garveyite flavor. Communist Party tends to claim responsibility, but I've never been entirely convinced by that. Did we learn anything new about that particular episode? Because that was, I think, a really important moment, because that invasion of one of the two independent countries in Africa has such a resonance in South Africa and around the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that. I thought I'd seen a few hands, other hands on Zoom, but I'm not seeing them now. Maybe we can get to some of the... Okay, great. Can I go to that question? So there was I don't know if I need to be farther away or closer. It's all... Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
All right, so there's a number of comments, and this has been partly answered by Anusa, but Alfred Mafaleka, who's from Kasatu. Question 1, what age was Kadali and Samba when they started the ICU? And there's an answer there. Can you just scroll down a little bit there to Anusa's answer? Yeah, what age were they when they started this? And Anusa said Samba was in his 30s when he accepted the mission to start the ICU in Rhodesia. He says we should also remember that ethnic tensions were chronic among ICU activists, and they were often encouraged and exploited by the government. Alfred's other point is tensions in the ICU seem endemic in its nature, jack of all trades. And I think a lot of this is a comment. Jimmy Laguma and Johnny Gomez were expelled from the ICU for the communist link. The ICU purged the Communist Party in South Africa. Kadali was accused of business unions after he was accused of business unionism. And there was certainly some dodgy stuff, let me tell you. He kicked out the communists. Samba then joined the church. But the ICU is a forerunner to most, if not all, federations like COSATU, the ZCTU in Zimbabwe and in Zambia. What about its long-term influence in Malawi? Now, I think that may be a question for Anusa, and I don't know if Henry D is online. So there's a question of its influence in Malawi, because you've got all these Malawian links. Was its demise in its politics? Okay, and then he just makes the point that black workers were excluded from the union laws. All right, so I think let's go up to the others. I want to just read the Peter Lim comments, and then I think we can address. Okay, Peter Lim makes the point. Now, just bear in mind, Prof. Chitja co-wrote his article with Peter. Peter has also edited a book, for example, on Bantu, which was the newspaper of the African National Congress. He's done a whole lot of work on the early ANC. Anyway, he makes the point, notionally high numbers in the ICU, but membership was often ephemeral. Some branches disappeared in a year. And I think that raises the question around the chronology. When do we count the ICU? Then Peter Lim asks, I wonder if the German artisans refer to Alex Laguma in terms of Laguma's role in the strike in 1918, if they had strikes. Okay, I'll come to that. Go down, there's a request from Ntai or Norman Mampani at Kasatu. All right, Peter Lim continues, small town meetings were important because farm laborers often walked or rode into town. to attend. The rhetoric and repertoires of performance, citing Charles Silly, of ICU leaders, are recorded by the police, and they're very interesting. And I think it's an important thing here. The South African police spied on early movements from about 1914, and they're extensive records, so they're often almost verbatim. But I think what Peter's pointing to is the rhetoric and repertoires of performance of ICU leaders recorded by the police are interesting, but they don't often have feedback from the rank and file. So it's a challenge. How do we know what ordinary people thought? He mentions oral histories at Wits. There were a whole big project. Charles van Onselen, Helen Bradford, and others were involved, and they spoke to elderly ICU members. It captures some of the attitudes and disappointment, but the questions didn't actually ask about the politics of the ordinary people. That's very interesting. Keep going down. Alfred asks if Prof. Twala can go new school and start to use slides. Prof. Twala says his allergy to technology is fading away. Peter Lim says buy the book. That's where you'll see it. Dave Hempson says cool book. It's a shift from our narrow nationalism. Okay, Peter Lim makes the other point that, look, shop stewards, this was a problem in the ICU. Many ICU members were not organized industrially or by factories, and there was a lot of repression by the state, the employers, and white farmers. But increasingly, the ICU relied on political rhetoric. This is speeches, right? This is, and land buying schemes. And they couldn't really get onto mines, which were incredibly policed. And there wasn't really a big industrial working class. So I think that covers most of those. I don't know if there's any other things. Otherwise, we can just do...
Thanks, Prof. I think it's important that when we draw lessons from the past, we must also identify also what were the problems then, so that we take a holistic approach. I want to check what happened at the time when Clemens, Kadal, and other ICU leaders were charged for financial malpractice in the late 1927, because that led to number of branches. They splitted and they formed their own unions, so that we don't have one perception thinking that, everything was good at that time. Thank you.
Great. And I think the last intervention here.
Thanks, Kwezi Mabasa. Just two quick questions. One, I think what was striking was Prof. Lucien mentioning that the ICU mainly organized around the countryside and rural areas. Now, given the centrality of land and agrarian questions in the liberation movement, what was the ICU's positioning around that? And then the second question would be, you mentioned the importance of the transnational character of the ICU. What would you think was the central ideological impulse that drove that? Yeah.
Great. So let's start back with Prof. Twala. We admire your perseverance in not using PowerPoint, and we hope you stick to your guns. It's your right to do so. I wonder if you could kind of weigh in, and any kind of final remarks that you'd like to make would be most welcome as well. Thank you.
I just take note of the comments and questions from the colleagues, but I don't have answers at this point in time, except to say we are just scratching the surface with this book. And it is good that now we get feedback and on what is to be done in moving forward, because this is just the beginning of this big research project. And then we welcome all the comments, and perhaps if we do have time and everything allows, that we continue unpacking this ICU even further. Thank you very much.
Great, and thank you for your time today as well. It's very much appreciated. Dr. Daimon, any last thoughts or any of those questions that spoke to your interests in particular?
Thank you. The one raised by Lucien about the position or the existence of the ICU activity in Malawi. I think if he was going to be there, one of the speakers, Henry D, I think would have answered to that very, very well. But for my own readings as well, I find it a bit ironic that whilst it was more established, in these other areas, in Malawi, there's very little, about the ICU, despite the fact that, some of the main founders, Clement Kadali himself, came from Malawi. There's very little paper trail, to that effect. And I think that is something, that we going forward, we can look at and work on as well. Thank you.
Great, and thank you as well. Lucien, last word to you.
Yeah,
I left you with a bit there.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, I mean, I agree with my colleagues. There's a lot to learn, and going back to the past is challenging because what are the source materials? But I think Mzoli was correct, and Chitja was correct that we also must not have a presentist approach. The past is not just exactly like today, but without smartphones. The world was different and conditions were different and the challenges were different. I think Alfred makes the point, but bear in mind that there were no legal rights for Black trade unions. Or more precisely, pass-carrying Black Africans were governed under very repressive labor laws, often amounting essentially to indenture. And the contracts on the mines until the late 1970s for Black workers were pretty much indenture. That meant it would be illegal to strike. It would be a criminal offense, and it happened. Julie Wells is here, and I just want to recognize you, Julie, because she's written about women's protests around pass laws in Bloemfontein back in the day. And Nicole Ulrich was online. I think she's gone now, but she looked at the ICU in Bloemfontein and its relation to women. So I want to just highlight that's another important part. Elizabeth van Heineken, I don't know if she's still online, but she looked at white women in the ICU. So the ICU's got a very interesting politics around gender and women and mothers and a whole complex range. So I don't want us to lose that. In that time, we need to also understand a lot of women were not in wage labor. And to reach women, you needed to have a slightly different politics, often around the household, production being done by women like beer brewing and so on. All right. Now, there are a few other things just to say. The ICU in Malawi, I think part of the answer is that the ICU is a workers' movement. Okay. And it's a movement, if it's not of workers, it's of tenant farmers, of sharecroppers or labor tenants, or of farm laborers, or of dock workers, or of workers on the railways, or of self-employed women. Malawi, it's had a huge amount of mission stations, a huge amount of education, but had almost no industry or employment, which is why people like Robert Sambo or Clemens Kadali came down to Zimbabwe. I mean, Kadali worked in Zimbabwe, he worked in Mozambique, he worked in South Africa. They came down for work. So there was a large pool of very educated Africans who could not find work, graduate unemployment really, could not find work in South Africa, in Malawi, and they came down. But it was very hard to set up a union in Malawi. Zambia, there were big copper mines, there were big growing cities, Chitwa and so forth. So I think it's partly there's a structural answer. John asked the issue of why did you have this big rural takeoff? Well, I think part of it, it's mostly in South Africa and Zimbabwe, or Southern Rhodesia as it was then. And I think a lot of it is, and this is not an argument I've come up with, this argument of Terry Ranger and Charles von Onselen and Helen Bradford, that there's a massive restructuring going on in the countryside in the late 20s in South Africa. This is when the Land Act really kicks in. And a lot of the Land Act in South Africa is not about the 13% to the 87%. A lot of it is about stopping Black people on farms being anything on a farm except a laborer or a labor tenant. So up to then, many Black people were on white farms, but they farmed for themselves and they paid rent with some of their crop or the money from their crop.
Now, the Land Act closes that down. So a lot of people are forced down into the proletariat. And there's a huge backlash. And a similar thing is happening in Rhodesia in the 30s with the Land Apportionment Act of 1931, which is a similar process of enclosure. So there's a lot of heat in the countryside. The ICU is able to speak to that. Now, Kwezi, what was the ICU's program? The ICU's program on the land was to fight for better wages, but ultimately, the ICU gave people the impression it was planning to seize the farms as the union. It didn't call for nationalization. It's interesting. The ICU didn't call for state control. It didn't run in elections. It did sometimes intervene in elections in weird and strange ways, even voted for the pact government of the National Party in 1924. Long story. But yeah, it sometimes intervened, but fundamentally it wasn't around elections and it wasn't around state control. Sometimes it had plans to set up factories or cooperatives, but the promise it made to many rural people, at least what they heard, was that on Christmas Day, 1927 in South Africa, the ICU was going to grab the farms. And this led to a massive backlash, and laws were literally passed to stop the ICU, and ICU halls were burned down in places like Ladysmith. It was a massive, thousands of people were evicted, but that was their land program. And their constitution said they aim at direct worker control of industry. And that goes to John's other question around syndicalism. Look, syndicalism, it's a label we use a lot now, but it was the idea that workers through their unions could run industry and should run industry. That's what it meant in those days. And it was an influence on the ICU, but in the ICU, it got mixed with other things. And I think the ICU, I wouldn't call it syndicalist. It had some syndicalism, it had some Garveyism, and maybe its contribution was it mixed things in very interesting and evolving ways. It was sort of like Zapatismo, the original Zapatistas in Mexico in the 1910s. It's a mix of all sorts of things, a very different new politics. All right, look, the very last thing here is the transnational character. Look, it's an interesting question, and there are tensions in the ICU on what this means. But certainly for some in the ICU, they envisaged, and Henry D is not here, and he's writing a biography of Kadali, which will hopefully come out as a book soon. Henry D makes the point that the ICU imagined a Southern African region. And it proposed at times, including Clemens Kadali, that the solution on immigration was to have a minimum wage and equal rights across the region. So the issue of cheap immigrant labor was to be solved by leveling people up, allowing them to move freely and giving them equal rights. All right, so they thought about it. As I said at their founding convention, they said one great union south of the Zambezi, not the Limpopo, the Zambezi. So I think that imagination was different, and it wasn't nationalist in the later way. Where there was nationalism was more Garveyism, which was more Pan-Africanist, but there was also this worker identity, which was a big part of it. So I'm not going to say any more there. I think we can agree with them. Zoli, the ICU tore itself apart a lot. The lack of democratic controls was part of it. There were by the 1930s, there were 3 ICUs in South Africa who hated each other's guts. Many people left the ICU for the Communist Party trade unions as well. The late Tom Lodge actually talks about in the book. So we'd like to encourage everybody to give the book a good read. It brings together new work. It's not going to give you the whole story. It's not going to give you the whole story. We don't know the whole story. Okay, thank you.
Great. It's been a long day, but that was a fantastic way to end, right? And thanks everyone for your comments and your participation. A huge thanks to all of those of you who joined online, in particular for our contributors, Dr. Daimon and Professor Twala, and of course Professor van der Walt here in the room. One more round of applause for the contributors.